Hey guys, so this is going to be a short introductory video on my favorite art historian, Aby Warburg. And as you can see here, I have 3 books. These are the 3 books I have by him or about him. And yeah, we're just going to go in order. So the first book we have here is his biography written by Ernst Gombrich, who wrote a pretty popular book called, I believe it's called The Story of Art. It's like kind of a popular art history book that was published, I think maybe 70s, 80s. Anyway, I haven't read it, but I know a lot of people like it as like an introductory art history text. So if you know his name, Gombrich is connected pretty intimately with Warburg. So this is the biography by Warburg. He was born in 1866 in Hamburg to a banking family, and he died in 1929. So he pretty much spans the modernist period. He was born a little earlier than the majority of the modernists, but he lives until 1929. So that makes him, you know, roughly the same age as someone like W.B. Yeats, who also kind of preceded the period as well, but lived through it. So anyway, yeah, like I said, he was born into a banking family, and the reason he didn't go into banking, well, one of the reasons he was able to not go into banking is because when he was a teenager, growing up and, you know, finding out what he wanted to do, he decided that he didn't want to go into his family's banking business. Luckily, his younger brother did, Max. And so they made a deal. Aby said that if Max gave him unlimited book funds, unlimited funds for books, then he would, you know, sign over the inheritance or the, you know, continuation of the banking business to the younger brother instead of the oldest, Aby. So they made that deal. Maybe Max didn't quite know what that meant or how much money that would be, but they made the deal. So that enabled Aby to travel, collect books. He ended up going to school in Bonn, if I remember correctly, and studying art history, but also he didn't confine himself to art history. He also studied biology. He thought at some point he might become a medical doctor. He studied psychology pretty thoroughly, and this would have been in the early 1890s. Late 1880s, early 1890s, when he was really spending most of his time on his studies. And one thing I thought was kind of funny, of course, he didn't have to work. And so he was taking 21 hours of lectures a week. And then he ended up finding that a teacher was teaching a course on art of the Dutch Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance. So he added that on too. So he was taking 24 hours of lectures a week in the late 1880s in Germany, mostly art history courses, but he also branched out. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And that's really when he started on his path to becoming one of the major art historians of the early 20th century, because he took many courses on the Italian Renaissance. And he was lucky to be in Germany at that time because they had some of the best universities in the world. And so he got an excellent education. He did end up going to Italy and studying, you know, Botticelli was his dissertation that he wrote to get his doctoral degree. And so he actually was able to go to Italy and study the works themselves in person. And that really set him on his trajectory. Another thing, though, he met, so let me see, did he meet him or did he just study him? Anyway, I'm not certain on the the specifics of it, but he encountered the work of Adolf Bastian, who was an art historian, but also studied like folk beliefs and mythology. He was kind of one of those more broad thinkers. And that also got Warburg on to what could be called more primitive art that didn't have the backing of an industrialized civilization or a written culture, perhaps. And so in 1895, Warburg went to America to celebrate his brother's wedding, his brother Paul. And in doing that, he was in the East Coast, typical for the time. The East Coast was really by far the most developed and had, all the cultural centers, New York, Boston, that sort of thing. But Warburg didn't just stay in the East Coast. He ended up going to Washington, D.C. to go to the Smithsonian Institute, which at the time was the cultural and scientific hub of the United States, as Warburg calls it. And he met Cushing, he met James Mooney, the famous Cherokee expert, and also wrote a monograph on the ghost dance religion. And then in New York City as well, before that, he had met Franz Boas, the famous anthropologist, the extremely famous German anthropologist of Native America. And so that set him on a track to want to study the Native American culture, and that led him to the Pueblo region. So that would be north, like New Mexico, Arizona, southern Colorado. That's really where it was mainly present at that time in the late 1890s, mid 1890s. And one fascinating thing that I wanted to talk about is when I was reading his biography, I found this section here. So this is when he's in, I believe, New Mexico, Keam Canyon. And what he did is, after looking at, these artifacts, he was fascinated with the mixture of Indo-Hispanic art. So after the Spanish had come in the 1600s, late 1500s, 1600s, and so on, and mixed the mixture between that and then the Pueblo art. But one fascinating thing is, near the end of his trip, he asked a school teacher at Keam Canyon to let the children illustrate a little tale in which a thunderstorm occurred. He wanted to see how lightning would be rendered. His expectations were not disappointed. While most of the Americanized children used the modern conventional zigzag line, 2 of the 14 boys depicted lightning in the form of an arrow-headed serpent. And that was just amazing to me that he asked the students to do that and picked it out whenever they drew differently, depending on the cultural imagination that was handed down to them through their family, or whoever handed it down to them. Well, it can be assumed their family. And just that, I think, really gives you an idea of how Warburg thought about art history. He was really, really focused on the psychological makeup of the person creating the art, and then how that imagination was passed on through history. Over thousands of years is really what he was interested in. And after this period, he goes back to Germany. He donates many of the artifacts to different ethnographical museums in Germany, and presumably he kept some for himself, but I know he donated some of them to a museum in Hamburg. And he continues studying Renaissance art. This goes on for 20 years till the early 1900s. He gets more and more well known for being an expert in especially, Renaissance Italian art. And that leads us to World War I, and then to the end of World War I, where in 1918, Warburg has a mental breakdown, where in this biography, it's not really delved into very much, but there's basically a gap of 5 years from 1918 to 1923 or so, where Warburg is in and out of mental hospitals. He's being taken care of by nurses, and he eventually ends up under the care of a psychiatrist. And it's just vaguely alluded to, like, what he was going through, but extreme fear, paranoia, anxiety, mixed with manic episodes, and it just seems like it was a pretty terrible time for him. But after this, he ends up in 1923, he ends up much better off, and as a way to prove that he's better off, he asks if he can give a lecture to his fellow inpatient, the inpatients at the particular hospital he's at. And he prepares a lecture on the snake dance, where he goes back almost 20 years, no, more than 20 years, to his time in America. And I was extremely happy to see that this book was published just this year. It's published by Hatya Kantz, and it's The Lightning Symbol and Snake Dance. So I already told you about the lightning symbol. The snake dance was a particular ritual and idea from the Pueblo culture. And this book goes into that a little bit, but it's mainly a collection of the artifacts that Warburg collected and then were eventually, put in museums. And personally, one reason I really was pleased about this is because I've been down to Mesa Verde, which is in southern Colorado, where they have the Cliff Palace, and it's just unbelievable. Like architecture up in cliffs. And if you've never looked at that, definitely search it up, because it is one of the most unbelievable constructions in the Americas. You have the Mississippi mound builders with the Cahokia mounds. You have the cliff palaces with the Anasazi, or the ancient Pueblo culture. You have the Mayan pyramids, you have some Aztec creations, the culture previous to them, the Teotihuacan, and you have, the Incas, and you have the Norte Chico civilization, but definitely the Pueblo architecture and the cliff palaces is up there in that class of buildings and civilizations. But of course, Warburg was much after that time, so he was collecting their artifacts that had survived the colonialism and the loss of cultural artifacts and knowledge. Just to give you an idea of some of the things that he would have collected at that time, and I'll go back to the lecture he gave. So here are some of the artifacts he took back. And many of these he purchased in Santa Fe or from people around Santa Fe, either from the original people who owned them and passed them down, or from other collectors that had already collected it for him. The rain god, head of the rain god. But yeah, so just to give you a bit of a glimpse of it. And so, like I said, 1923, over 20 years after he had been to America to study this Pueblo art, Pueblo culture, he gives this lecture as the first lecture in 5 years that he had attempted, and he gives it to his fellow mental hospital patients. And it's, very successful. He plans the lecture, he gets all of his ideas together. That is, signifies that he's ready to go back into the world, and he's, gotten a lot better. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is that part of the reason why he went back to this Pueblo art is because he saw it as a more emotional or more energetic, or it had more potential than some of the other artistic creations that he had looked at a lot. And he kind of connected it in his head to the Greek art of the 5th century, 6th century, this pre-Hellenistic Greek sculpture and Greek artwork as containing the same energy. And so he gave this lecture. He is able to go back to his normal daily life. But while he was in this 5 years of suffering and difficulty, one of his friends, Fritz Saxl, had been maintaining his library, the Warburg Library in Hamburg, which, again, like I mentioned, with his younger brother who had taken over the banking firm, Warburg had been amassing this huge art history library, just, anything that you could imagine, especially focused on the Florentine Renaissance, but, just amazing art history in general, monographs, etc. Just a world-class library for art history. So when Warburg gets out, he goes back, spends a lot of time at his library. And a kind of interesting side note is that Ernst Cassirer ends up at the same library and studies there. And of course, he's known for his philosophy of symbolic forms. And that brings me back really quickly. I wanted to touch on something else in Warburg's biography, where you get to this same time period. So 1926. So this is a little bit after what I just mentioned, but this is the time when he's really developing his idea of symbolism and the theory of social memory related to symbolism. And there's a passage I want to mention, this theory of the Mnemosyne demanded the existence of such unbroken chains of tradition. So he's imagining, he first started on this path by tracking the classical art, so like Greek classical art themes or motifs throughout thousands of years, and then they find themselves cropping back up in the Florentine Renaissance. So that means that in one way or another, either through rediscovery or through an unbroken chain of tradition, these gestures and images from classical Greek art found their way 1,500 years later or so to Florence in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages. And so that's kind of what got him on this track of looking for these symbols. The symbol in Warburg's reading was the counterpart in the collective mind to the engram in the nervous system of the individual. Its continued existence and validity amidst all transformations was therefore a postulate of the theory. He looked for what he sometimes called the Leitfossil, borrowing the term from the geologists who determine geological strata from the evolutionary stage of certain organisms that dominate the epoch concerned. To uncover and display the state of these evolutions of a symbol in the successive periods of history was to be the aim of the method Warburg hoped to develop. And it was closely linked with how he ended up wanting to portray the display of photographs on screens. Warburg had a difficult time writing a conclusive text because he had so many ideas going at the time, and he had a very personal way of writing. So even if he did, write a conclusive essay, it would have been a relatively small number of people who could have truly understood what he meant. So I think at the time of this biography in the 80s, I believe it came out, there was only one essay by Warburg translated into English, and it was about his snake dance lecture and his thoughts afterwards on it. And then, after this period where he was at the Warburg Library, 1923, beginning then, and then continuing on until his death in 1929, including Ernst, a couple other names that would be valuable to look into, Fritz Saxl, you have Gombrich, of course, you have Klibansky, you have, there's one other person, my mind's blanking, but one book I've been meaning to get, and unfortunately I didn't buy when it was reasonably priced, and now it's out of print, I suppose, but it's Saturn and Melancholy, which was following in the same tradition as Warburg, and it was actually by Fritz Saxl, Raymond Klibansky, and then this third name of the person has blanking my mind right now, but yeah, that book is in this Warburg tradition. So if you're interested in anything I'm talking about now, definitely check that book out if you can find it. You might have to get it at a library. But anyway, as I was saying, so the final stage of Warburg's life was in his library, and he was collecting these gestures and images that could be traced through the earliest periods of Western culture. And he was tracing them as time went on in the social memory of different time periods and groups to the present day, Warburg's 1920s. And so this all accumulated to produce his, masterwork, the Bilderatlas Mnemosyne, which originally was an exhibition put out. He was planning it for years, and if I remember correctly, it never got fully exhibited. There were smaller scale exhibitions, but I can't remember exactly if it ever got fully exhibited. The reason I say that is because it was never printed. This edition that was put out by the Warburg Library, which in 1933, after his death, was moved to London because of the Nazis. This volume was partially produced by the Warburg Library. I'm sure they funded it significantly, but this one just came out a year or two ago. And so my kind of pitch about this is the art history analogy to Finnegan's Wake. And so I will just show you guys what it is. So it's a massive book. Before I show you exactly what it is, so this book here, the Snake Dance book, is a little smaller than Bottom's Dream. So that gives you an idea of exactly how big this book is. If it helps at all, I'm a relatively large human, and this is my hand. So it's a massive book, by far the largest book I have. Whenever I first ordered it, I got it at my doorstep, and I thought they had made a mistake. I didn't realize this book was that big. And then Hatje Kans put this out too. So here's Warburg up here. Look at this amazing picture. Warburg up there in the middle, and this is, I believe, his library. Yeah, it must be. But anyway, yeah, you see you have some essays here. There was supposed to be a companion volume, the commentary. I believe it was supposed to be published earlier this year, but it hasn't come out yet, and I think it got pushed back a whole year, so we have to wait longer for that. But you see here that it's about 130 pages or so of the Bilderatlas. And this is what it looked like originally. He would have these large black panels with photographs pinned to it. So as time went on, he would shift around the artwork, add more. Presumably he'd take some away, but I know he was adding a lot as he found more. And he would build these panels, and they were set up like this. You can see with books down here how large it is. It's multiple feet high. That's why this book is so large itself. Yeah, Gertrude being Aby Warburg and Franz Boas. No, that's the Palace Hotel in Rome, so that wasn't his library. But he wrote notes on what should be on each panel, and it took summer and autumn of 1929. So it took, what is that, 90 years to be reproduced, almost 100 years to be reproduced. And here is panel A. So you see at the top there on the left, you have notes for exactly what each panel is. So you can see the top piece is celestial plan by which one can know what time it is all over the earth on any meridian and polis height, any length and width. And then you have, of course, a map of the Mediterranean. And then Aby Warburg's genealogical tree of the Tornabuoni family. And there's not a whole lot of writing to go along with it. You're told what each is, but especially with this one. This is the one where I kind of started to understand what he was doing. So you can see panel B, different degrees of the application of the cosmic system to mankind, harmonic correspondence, later reduction of harmony to abstract rather than cosmically contingent geometry. So you see here, number 1 at the top left is representation of a vision by the Saint Hildegard of Bingen. So 1200, then you see the same gesture, the relation of man to the cosmos with Leonardo, and then you see the hand, the anatomy, anatomical structure. So this is panel B. I'm really interested for the commentary because, as you can see, this book is, and then here you get the idea of what he was doing with all the way to the present. So you have that, I believe, is Kepler's, Platonic solids, drawing of the Platonic solids, all the way through the revolution of the planets, and then the Zeppelins. And that's supposed to be the evolution of the conceptualization of Mars, moving away from the anthropomorphizing understanding, image, harmonic system to symbol. I'll just show a couple of these so you can get an idea of what it's like, because I would say if any of this is fascinating to you and you can manage to swing the cost, I would highly recommend getting this. This is like a once in a century type of book. You don't get books like this put out that normal people can buy. It is fairly expensive. I think, if I remember correctly, the retail price is $200, but you can find it lower than that sometimes, and I would highly, highly recommend. So here's panel 3. You see Ptolemaic hieroglyphs, late Ptolemaic, looking at the zodiac. One reason I put off this video for so long is I kind of felt like, I had to have something to say interpretively about these panels, but to me at least, it's almost to the point where you're listening to a symphony. And what better way to talk about the symphony than just to play it and listen to it to someone who hasn't heard it before, perhaps. And here's a really impressive image here, the Laocoon, the death of Laocoon, the late Roman. Wait, no, that's different. There was, yeah, that's one of the images here. Let's see, that is number 7. Yeah, that's, was it 50 BC? Apollodorus, yeah, Laocoon and his sons, late 1st century BC, that's right. Yeah. Amazing. That was the one I was talking about, the late Roman. Just amazing, these gestures. So anyway, yeah, like I was saying, I don't have a whole lot insightful to say about this, but it is just a wonder to behold. And as I've been thinking through this, I've been, reading Ernst Cassirer, I've been reading James Joyce, I've been researching Indo-European poetics and mythology, and I've been, one thing too that is fascinating is that, the Fraser with the golden bow was just around the same time period as Warburg, and, just this tracing of the genetic history of the culture, not genetic as in DNA, which comes much later, but, and again, not even in the racial terms that they would have thought about it in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but the genetic in the sense of where each particular idea was born and how that idea lived on in the imagination of the people and in the imagination of the culture as well, throughout time, over thousands of years. That's the thing that is just unbelievable to me, that Joyce captures with Finnegan's Wake with the idea of the monomyth, and then you see an Indo-European poetics and myth with certain mythological ideas being found in northern India and Greece and England and, the Scandinavia, partially portrayed through the Middle East, continued through the Middle East into Europe in the Middle Ages, and so on. But yeah, so I probably should end this video here. This has gone on longer than I was expecting, but highly recommend Aby Warburg. He's, like I said, my favorite art historian. It's just unbelievable that we're able to get this stuff still. There's no way this book should have ever been printed. We're way too fortunate to have something like this. And yeah, I just wanted to mention him and give him a brief introduction, because I think anyone who likes my videos or is interested in modernism to the extent I am, and then also interested in antiquity, you would absolutely love reading about Warburg and then his Warburg school that came after. So let me know if you've already been interested in Warburg, you know about him, you've read his books. If there are any books that I don't have that you'd recommend, let me know. I'm eagerly awaiting the commentary volume to this next year. And then, yeah, if anyone knows how to get a cheap copy of Saturn and Melancholy, definitely let me know. All right, so death is a gang boss.